Hello, welcome to my series on Bergson and his philosophy of mind, emphasis on the holographic aspects. In this series, or part 4, we'll be discussing his model of memory and the implications thereof, retrieving the past, the notion of direct memory, the laws of redintegration, which, put more simply, are simply retrieving experiences from the past, and the whole notion of the complete storage of the past in detail that's implied in Bergson. Again, a very quick review from the previous parts. For Bergson, the universal field is a holographic field, a vast interference pattern, as such non-imageable, looks nothing like the external world as we know it, the world of coffee cups and spoons. And the brain is conceived to be a modulated reconstructive wave, or supporting the creation of a modulated reconstructive wave passing through this holographic field. This brain-supported wave is specific to a source in the holographic field. By this process now an image, the coffee cup on our kitchen table. There is no image of the coffee cup in the brain. Again, the brain / wave, a reconstructive wave, is simply specific to a source in the holographic field. It is not projecting an image. There's no image to look at by an homunculus, a little viewer inside the brain, but the wave is specific to a source in the field. Now in this model, we need to note, this is the fundamental implication we'll be dealing with here. Experience, therefore, is not occurring solely within the brain. The experience of the cup, the image of the cup, is right where it says it is. It's a specification of an aspect of the external holographic field right within the field, right where it says it is. That is, it's direct perception. Because of this, because it's not occurring solely within the brain, experience cannot be solely stored there. Now, Bergson noted in Matter and Memory that the whole concept that experience is stored in the brain is only an hypothesis. It has never actually been proven by science. But this hypothesis has the force of a dogma. It has this force precisely because without a bit of creativity, no one can see how experience cannot be stored in the brain in the first place. This would require actual creative thought, which Bergson has already done. Firstly, without a theory of perception that is of experience, as far as a memory theory goes, any theory of memory is utterly, intrinsically ungrounded. You can't have a theory of storage of experience, particularly of storage of experience in the brain, if you don't know what experience is in the first place. So the whole notion that experience is stored in the brain, being an hypothesis, as opposed to a dogma, comes down to precisely this. How can you be so certain if you don't know what experience is in the first place? Therefore, the origin of the image of the external world, as we've been discussing for the last 3 parts of this series, is the problem. It is the problem of the origin of experience. And the solution is Bergson's model of direct perception, where the brain is a reconstructive wave passing through a holographic field. But this requires then an entirely new model of memory. Secondly, in truth, there is no current understanding of how the brain actually stores experiences / events in the first place. If one reads the recent book, The Future of the Brain, by a couple neuroscientists on the massive attempt to simulate the brain via electronics, via silicon, etc., one will see the flat-out admission that actually we have no understanding whatsoever of how the brain actually stores experience. And as we saw in part 2, events such as stirring coffee, according to current theory, are supposedly disassembled into features, stored in separate areas, and then reassembled. And this disassembly, this breakdown into features, follows no principled method whatsoever. The features are simply guesses. And we saw that logical problems abound with this simple model of even handling a simple event like coffee stirring as an ongoing event over an extended period of time, which is the normal state of our perception, the perception of stirring spoons, flying butterflies, etc. Then secondly, again, along this secondly point, the features that these models are referring to are really creatures of dynamic flows. As we discussed, a rotating cube is really a set of flow fields, velocity flows. The velocity flows defined over its sides, and edges or vertices are truly nothing but sharp discontinuities at the junctures of these flows, which means that they don't exist as static entities. They're creatures of these flows and nothing more. But there's no attempt to describe how the brain stores flows or velocity flow fields, or any attempt to deal with the fact that the features are not static, but defined only over these flows. Thirdly, phenomena like amnesias and aphasias, memory loss phenomena in other words, are used as evidence to support storage in the brain, precisely because in a straight-out version of brain storage, then damage to the brain appears to destroy memories stored within the brain. Therefore, the inference is the memories truly must be stored there. But as Bergson argued, in essence, and I'm translating this in terms of holography, if the brain is retrieving experience as a reconstructive wave passing through the holographic field, amnesias or aphasias or other brain damage could be simply destroying the neural systems supporting the required complex modulation patterns, therefore wave patterns of the brain as it passes through this four-dimensional field. Therefore, it would look like memories are being destroyed, but in fact, they are not. So this was the essence of Bergson's argument in Matter and Memory. He spent 5 years, roughly, studying the memory literature before he published his book in 1896. His first book being Time and Free Will in 1889. Why did he spend 5 years studying the memory literature? Because he felt that the question, is experience stored in the brain, is the key to the problem of consciousness. Now, why is this the key? Such a statement that the theory of memory, of storage in the brain, is the key to the problem of consciousness is truthfully not found in current literature that I can see anywhere in the theory of consciousness, on the hard problem, or other aspects of the theory of consciousness. But the reason why the question is the key is simple. Memory is intrinsic to the conscious perception of an ongoing event. For example, the rotating cube, the fly buzzing by. When you're disassembling and storing static features, then trying to reassemble them on the fly in real time in order to reconstruct the event such that it can be perceived as the event is ongoing, well, as we saw, we have an utterly non-workable model. But if you cannot explain this fundamental memory problem, which underlies the perception of motion, of transforming events, of buzzing flies, rotating cubes, you have no theory of consciousness. This question of how we perceive an ongoing event and how we deal with its so-called storage in short-term memory is therefore utterly critical and utterly unresolved, as we saw Gibson note again in part 2. The conclusions that Bergson arrived at in Matter and Memory were such. The brain is not storing experience. Amnesias, for example, represent damage to the ability to assume a complex modulatory state or complex wave pattern passing through the holographic field. They don't represent the loss of experience. The experience is still there. It simply cannot be retrieved. And then the kicker to all this, on Bergson's analysis of the problem of perception and time, which we saw in parts 1 through 3, the brain is a modulated reconstructive wave, specifying or specific to events within the external holographic field. Then, as we noted, experience is not simply in the brain in the first place. For Bergson, the brain is, as it were, the 3D present in the current present instant cross-section of a four-dimensional being in the indivisible flow of time. Now I have my little picture there of a two-dimensional space with the third dimension being time. You have to imagine this being four-dimensional. And that's our space-time block, space-time structure. And it grows along the plane of the universal present. There's the next growth, next plane of the universal present, and then the next one. So it's growing over time. And the brain is simply a subsection within this whole growth. So the brain is a subportion of the time growth of the universal field. And what we have, however, is the brain is simply being, in reality, along with the body, a completely four-dimensional structure. Now this fourth dimension is not a spatial dimension. One could call it a internal dimension, a non-extended dimension would be the more precise term, an inextended or non-extended dimension, but it truly exists. And for Bergson, the whole of our experience is laid out along this fourth or non-spatial dimension. Now one has to remember that this kind of spatial model we're looking at here is completely derived via the notion of the indivisibility of the flow of time. So what we're really looking at is an extended structure precisely because there's no way to cut it in the first place. Now for Bergson, again in Matter and Memory, the essence of this memory, as he said, is to have a date. Now what he means by this is that all experiences laid out in order along this four-dimensional extent of being. So back there is 2001, at the end back 2002, 2003. In other words, the entirety of structure is laid out in order exactly as experienced, in the order that our experience took place. Now, for Bergson, in his metaphoric model, the brain is like a valve. So the valve is holding back the 4D mass of experience. It's like in our block there, as it were, the brain, our little red dot, is actually a dam holding back the flow of that experience into the present. And as the valve changes, according to the array of activated action systems in the body and the brain, according to that configuration, or the configuration of this array, various experiences are let through the valve into consciousness. So the vastness of our past and our past experience is always there. It's simply held back by the brain. The brain is really the limiter of the four-dimensional extent or awareness of the 4D extent of our experience. And in its transformation, as its states transform, as its action configurations change, then it allows various experiences to seep through into consciousness. So let's recast this in terms of holography and relate it to Gibson's invariance and invariance laws. We're going to talk in terms of the phenomenon of redintegration. Redintegration is ubiquitous in our experience. I'm walking along and I see a rustle in the grass. The rustle in the grass redintegrates or brings back the experience of having seen a snake slithering through the grass. So a rustle in the grass redintegrates an earlier experience of seeing a snake. Or I see a lightning strike and it redintegrates a time in childhood when lightning struck our house. These are ubiquitous remembering type experiences, but they're redintegration. Redintegration was a term coined by Christian Wolff, a disciple of Leibniz, in his work The Empirica Psychologia in 1732. And he described it roughly as thus: a previous event, friend's pattern, is recalled by reinstatement of part of the original event. I'm putting pattern there because we'll relate this to Gibson in a second. So a previous event is recalled by reinstatement of a part of the original event. The Gibsonia inversion, 275 years later, looks like this. An event, E prime, that is a current event, reconstructs a previous event, E, when E prime, the current event, is defined by the same invariant structure. Now, relate this to pattern in that invariant structures are patterns. And I like to symbolize this little law simply by E prime redintegrates E. But the pattern is the invariant structure. I could go into great detail, and I have elsewhere, on how psychology has actually been working on this law, trying to explicate it ever since Wolff in 1732, but has miserably failed to grasp the nature of the patterns. And while miserably failing, has miserably ignored Gibson and his actual definition of what these patterns, these event patterns are, which are invariant structures. So I'm going to review very quickly what we discussed in part 2 again on the invariant structures and Gibson's invariance laws. Now, we have a simple event, coffee stirring, but that event is completely filled with invariance laws. It is defined by multiple invariance laws and levels of invariance laws. The coffee stirring is an invariant structure, and we'll be interested in redintegrating an event like coffee stirring, bringing back an experience of coffee stirring. But we're going to look at the patterns, and remembering Bergson, we have to remember that these patterns are ultimately related to action and the configuration of action systems. So we noted in part 2 that there's things like texture density gradients, where you have a precise gradient with the horizontal separation of the texture elements there a function of the inverse function of the distance, and the vertical separation a function of the inverse function of the distance squared. And of course, our coffee cup is sitting on precisely such an array of texture density gradients when it sits on a table. And we noted that the very size constancy of the cup, the height constancy, is preserved by an invariance relation, an invariant ratio of the size of the cup, the height of the cup, to the number of texture unit rows occluded as it moves. In this case, from 4 rows in the back to 2 rows in the front, as the size, the height of the cup doubles. So height of the cup doubles, and then the number of texture rows occluded halves. An invariance law just for specifying size constancy, and we noted that this would relate to how the action systems would be adjusting as the cup is moving toward us and we want to grasp the cup. There are optical flow fields, velocity vectors, where the velocity vectors have an inverse relation to the distance from the eye. The fastest velocity vectors in the forward perspective and the slower moving velocity vectors further away, reducing in velocity according to the distance squared. And we noted that these are ubiquitous. For example, as we're driving down the road, there's a flowing velocity field going by us. And we noted that there are ratios defined over these fields. For example, the tau ratio, as I've noted over on the right, where tau indicates the severity of impending impact, and this ratio would again be transduced through the action systems such that a bird could modulate his landing, control his landing for a nice soft landing if you're a bird. There's even something called grasping tau, which would be important in specifying and relating to action in simply grasping the cup. And we noted that form itself is a function of these velocity fields, as we have in our picture there with what I like to call a rotating Gibsonian cube, where we have velocity flows defined over the sides, an expanding flow as the side rotates toward us, a contracting flow as the side rotates away from us, a radial flow field on the top. And if you can see the relation here for a cup, we'll just pretend that we have a cubical cup. And we'll note that even the form that we're looking at in our coffee stirring cup is going to be a function of these velocity fields, velocity flows. And just leaving vision for a second, we can note that when we're stirring, there's a inertial tensor defined where this has a precise definition in terms of a matrix where the diagonal elements represent the object's resistance to angular acceleration, in this case, the spoon. So as I'm stirring the coffee, that event of stirring has these physical forces involved where the inertial tensor is specific to the object's angular acceleration and the resistance to that angular acceleration. And it's going to be an intrinsic part of the event. Another such event, very embedded within the dynamic forces of stirring, is an adiabatic invariant, coined so by the physicist Ehrenfest, where that's defined as the energy of oscillation over the frequency of oscillation, all being equal to a constant. So there's an invariant ratio of energy of oscillation to frequency of oscillation, termed in adiabatic invariant. And again, as I am stirring with a certain periodicity and frequency, I have, again, an aspect of the event defined by this very physical, dynamically defined relationship of the adiabatic invariant. So what we're stressing here is the event is very physical and very concrete, involves a very concrete dynamics, not only with the visual, but with the kinesthetic, with the forces involved. All are involved in, all are aspects that could be involved in redintegrating the event. So to define an invariant structure briefly, invariant structure is the transformations and structural invariants which render the event a virtual action, which allow us to act simultaneously upon that event. And I have to have you harken back to parts 1 and 3, particularly part 3 on the definition and meaning of virtual action. So the law of redintegration, Gibson style, as we noted, is an event reconstructs a previous event, E, when that current event is defined by the same invariant structure, or I'm adding here a subset thereof, because as we've just seen, there are many aspects to an event with invariance laws. And one or some set of these invariants will bring back the event. Representing them in the present will bring back the event. Again, my little symbol, E prime redintegrates E. So one of these aspects could be the swirling flow field. That could be presented simply as a computer animation of the flowing field, or blindfolded, simply wielding an object and recreating the same inertial tensor that the original spoon stirring created, or again stirring with the same periodicity, that is recreating the same adiabatic invariant that defined that coffee stirring. So we're going to throw this into a standard memory paradigm that memory research has used for a long time. It's called the period associate paradigm. In the period associate paradigm, I'm learning a list of words. Now, this is very word-oriented, verbal-oriented. It's called the verbal learning tradition in memory literature. And that's part of its limitation as an experimental paradigm, is that it's very verbally oriented and therefore missing most of what I just described in terms of invariance laws, but we're going to discuss it anyhow. So what the task for a subject would be to learn a list of words, of paired words. You'd learn that spoon goes with coffee, that when you see the word spoon, that its paired response is coffee. When the experimenter presents you the word knife, the paired response is soap. Or when he presents the word bottle, this paired response is thimble. Now, normally such a list would be maybe 10, 15 words, pairs long. And your task would be to learn the pairings of each of these pairs, so that when the recall test is given, I'm simply showing the word bottle and I have to remember, oh yeah, that thimble is the response. Now, to make this worse, of course, they can have you learn another list at a second time, where you notice we have the same response words, spoon, knife, and bottle, but now we have different, same stimulus words, spoon, knife, and bottle, but you have different response words. For spoon, you have to learn that batter is the response, or for knife, that wood is the response, or for a bottle, that pan is the response. And now, of course, the memory task is complicated. Now, this paradigm is called the Abac paradigm. If you know, list 1, the responses are A, the stimulus terms are called A, the response terms B. In list 2, again, we have A, and then the response words are C. So A, B, A, C. So that's the Abac paradigm. This is a difficult thing to do, to learn both of these lists, because obviously, how do you keep them straight? If you are probably given by the experimenter that, okay, we're working on list 2 now. here's the word spoon, what's its response? And you have to remember, well, you're dealing with what's termed interference, because, well, for list 1, it used to be coffee, but now for list 2, it's batter. Or for list 1, it was soap for knife, but now for list 2, it's wood for knife. The problem, therefore, we could say is that spoon in and of itself is very nonspecific. Just using the word spoon, or even just laying a spoon on the table very statically, is very nonspecific to the event or the word you were supposed to learn. And as we noted, this is interference. This was coined by McGeoch in 1942. It was called response competition, or I like to call it event competition, because as the little picture shows there, I present a spoon to the brain, but the possible responses are B, C, D, E. In other words, in a simple case here, the possible response is coffee or batter. I could have made it worse with list 3, etc. So the spoon can reconstruct many events. They interfere with each other. And how do I know which one to bring back? Coffee or batter, soap or wood, thimble or pan. So this is a standard verbal learning paradigm and has been studied extensively. The difficulty is it's a verbal learning paradigm, and therefore captures none of the invariance laws or dynamics of an event. And the truth is, for each of these little pairs, we can imagine an event, like spoon stirring coffee, or a spoon stirring batter, or knife cutting a soap or flakes off a soap, as opposed to knife trying to shave shavings off of wood. You notice there's quite different dynamics involved. The bottle is pouring into a thimble, or the bottle is pouring into water into a pan. Well, two different precisions of action necessary to pour water into a thimble versus water into a pan. So there's much hidden dynamics, especially when we start to consider these as events. And in the verbal learning paradigm, this is the problem. There was nothing to prevent a subject from forming an event as he learned the list. That is, he learns spoon coffee. I can imagine a spoon stirring coffee. Spoon batter. I can imagine a spoon stirring cake batter, etc. And again, what you have them in this very non-ecological verbal learning paradigm is complete unconstrained actions of the subject on how they actually learned this list and the events they actually formed mentally as they learned. In the holographic version of this problem of interference, we discussed earlier something like this, where I had made a hologram of the cube using frequency 1 as a reference wave. Then I make a hologram of a coffee cup, same holographic plate, using reference wave frequency 2, a coherent wave frequency 2. We know that if we modulate the reconstructive wave to frequency 1, I'll get the cube. If I modulate the reconstructive wave to frequency 2, I'll get the cup. But if I have a very imprecise modulation where the frequency is a composite frequency of frequency 1 and frequency 2, I'm going to reconstruct a composite image, a superimposed fuzzed image of the cup and cube, which is to say I'm creating, as it were, interference. I don't have a precise enough reconstructive wave not to reconstruct multiple events. And as I noted, the spoon is something like my composite reconstructive wave of frequency 1 and frequency 2. It's not specific enough to the original event or pairing, namely to a cube or to a cup. It can reconstruct many different events or many different images. It's like an imprecise reconstructive wave. very analogous to what McGeoch was talking about with response or event competition or interference. So I've been indicating that what's missing in the verbal learning paradigm is the priority of the ecological, where we can have very concrete constraints upon our cue event, the cue event being spoon. So if I'm trying to reconstruct coffee as my response versus batter, I can be my cue event, and that's what the cue being the original event, spoon. What was the pair word, either coffee or batter? My event that I'm cueing, trying to cue that past event with, is it coffee stirring or batter stirring, can be defined with very precise physical attributes. That is, we could have stirring with a certain spatial amplitude, appropriate to stirring or appropriate to batter, coffee or appropriate to batter. We can have a certain resistance of the medium being specified as I'm stirring. I mean, batter is going to have a far greater resistance than coffee as a medium. We can be blindfolding a subject and simply having them wield a stirring device with a certain inertial tensor, one more appropriate to batter or one to coffee, or with a certain periodicity, a certain adiabatic invariant. In other words, in the standard ecological world, these events are very rich and specified by invariants in dynamics that allow for the redintegration of past events. And what we are in effect doing as we, for example, stir with a certain spatial amplitude, large versus small, is an ever finer tuning of constraints on the laws defining these events. Now it's interesting as I look over at my little coffee stirring on the left that you would have quite a different set of physical dynamics as far as stirring if you're actually standing on a large coffee cup wielding a huge spoon. And that would be quite different than simply presenting spoon as a verbal word as opposed to recreating some aspect of the dynamics of that event there itself, standing on the edge of the coffee cup with a monstrous spoon. So you can see dynamics is quite important and utterly ignored in the current cognitive science paradigms. In fact, to show the priority of the ecological, we can imagine an impossible verbal learning situation, which I've dubbed AB sub I. As opposed to ABAC, we have ABI, where we simply have a list that looks like this. Spoon coffee, spoon batter, spoon soup. That is, the stimulus word is always A, and the response word varies. In other words, in a purely verbal learning situation, this would be impossible to learn. You couldn't learn this list, because all you'd be given by the experimenter is the word spoon. What's the response? Well, soup. No, that's not the one I was looking for. So, but this is thoroughly possible in the ecological sphere, because we could imagine presenting a spoon with a certain spatial amplitude and adiabatic invariance that specified coffee, as opposed to batter, as opposed to soup, or as a spoon lifting cornflakes, or a spoon lifting oatmeal, etc. So coffee stirring's invariant structure is extremely dynamic. It involves invariants defined over time, such as the adiabatic invariant, the inertial tensors. In other words, there are also invariants defined over forces over time in overflowing fields. And of course, one would have to ask, how do you store such an event then in the first place that's defined by invariance over time and over forces over time? Well, actually, this question is quite unaddressed and unanswered, because the verbal learning paradigm, the memory paradigm, is largely proceed in this very abstract form of paradigm of verbal learning. And again, the answer is it is not stored. It is, it being the event, our coffee stirring event, is available as experience. It's experience as the four-dimensional extent of being, and the event must be retrieved by recreating a similar dynamic invariant structure. This is to say, again, taking the brain as a reconstructive wave, that we are recreating the original modulated wave pattern, defining/specifying the event. That is, we are recreating the original wave pattern via our reinstantiation of the dynamics, some aspect of the dynamics of stirring, whether it be flow fields, whether it be adiabatic invariants, tensors, etc. Any memory model, we need to note, must incorporate invariant structures. Else that model is useless and misguided. And of course, I've been implying that we've got a lot of somewhat useless and misguided models. They have some degree of validity, but they're missing completely this entire story about dynamics and invariance laws, and therefore what is required. One of these poor examples is the connectionist network, which is the darling of artificial intelligence and the current computer model of mind. Take, for example, this nice connectionist net by Rogers and McClellan. It looks very complicated, but if you focus on the little black dots for a second, starting from the left, you'll see that we have a black dot on canary. Now, those are input units to the net, okay, or input patterns, really. Those are input units where I can define a pattern. So if my input pattern is that one unit is turned on in this connectionist network, namely canary, all right, my purpose here is to, for the net, is to drag out the appropriate set of responses that the net has learned. In this particular scheme, they're also having a set of input units that represent relations. So the next line over on is-a, so canary is-a, and is-a or is, can, has. So I've activated the unit for can. So I'm trying to get a canary can do what? A canary can, and as I train the net, which is a gradual adjusting of the weights of these units such that the output layer, which has over on the far right the attribute layer, responds with the appropriate units. So in this case, once I've trained the net over many training trials to get all the statistics right of the net will respond with those four units on the right that are blacked out: grow, move, fly, and sing. So the canary then, according to the net, can grow or move, fly, and sing. Now the connectionists are claiming that this is a very ecological thing, that the net can deal with ecological events. For example, per Rogers and McClellan, if I have a bird in a tree, I can therefore redintegrate a bird flying away with this net. Okay, one can imagine training this net up such that, oh, I see a bird in a tree, that means the bird is probably going to fly away. Or if I have a spoon on a table, then that spoon is probably going to stir in coffee. So I could train a net up to represent these ecological events. A bird in a tree flying away, a spoon on the table picked up and stirring coffee. This is, of course, ridiculous, but we'll talk a little bit more about it. For connectionism, an object such as my spoon is again broken down into a set of features. Just like the cube rotating would be broken down into a set of features, its vertices, its edges. So whatever features that spoon might be conjectured to have, because remember, there is no actual principled method for breaking even an object such as a spoon down into a set of features. And unfortunately, as we'll see shortly, these features are in fact very dynamic themselves and are a function of the motions and forces that the objects are undergoing. So features can come and go depending on the forces and transformations, which means they can't be statically defined at all. But in this network, then, we have these features of the spoon put together, and I've made up some of these features for them on this list here, but you can see that on the right, we have features like a spoon has a cup, or is can be a stirrer, or is rigid. It can be wielding, whatever that would mean, because remember, wielding is very physically dynamically defined, and you're trying to define it here by a simple symbol. A stirrer, circling. And what they're trying to do here in this network, this network is a network by Dumas et al. In 2008, Psych Review, very prestigious. The network is called DORA. They're putting two events in memory, a stirrer as a spoon, stirrer plus spoon, and stirrer plus coffee, and those RB units, and creating a relationship where I have a stirrer, I can stir with a spoon and coffee. I'm not going to try to deal with how this all happens, but take my word for it, it happens in the net, that I can ultimately create this relationship, stir, paren, spoon, comma, coffee. So coffee stirring in this world is simply a concatenation of static relations and static features. Now here we have a depiction of creating one of these relationships in the first place, stirring a spoon. But what we have, as you notice, is the relationship of two events, spoon stirring and spatula stirring. The two events are being brought into memory. And of course, we're relying on a mapping of these static features to these two events to create, by what they term analogy, this relationship binding. And I'm attaching, in my little example here, features like wielding 1, wielding 2, wielding 3. What I'm trying to attempt to show here is you're picking some point on the continuum of the dynamic invariance laws defining wielding. Remember the inertial tensor, and there could be many possible wieldings, obviously, and simply to specify this by a symbol is rather absurd. And in truth, none of the dynamics are actually being really truly represented here. But in essence, what they're trying to simulate is redintegration, bringing two events together, which is what redintegration is. So this is how the connectionists approach it. From the previous network that we looked at with Rogers and McKellen, they also claimed they could get something like this. Again, I'm casting things in the spoon stirring, coffee stirring framework, but they could train their net up that we looked at previously. I have a mini version of their net now. A spoon can, and we get these appropriate responses: stir, scoop, cut, and balance. The difficulty is each of these, a spoon stirring, a spoon scooping, a spoon cutting cheese, for example, a spoon balancing on the edge of the cup are events. And the spoon then fits within the invariant structure of the event. It's an intrinsic part of the invariant structure and the laws of the dynamics, the visual changes, etc., of the events. And this is the problem. For example, I could simply say the spoon is a catapult. As little brother launches a pea with a spoon at big sister across the table. Well, the difficulty here is that in order for the net to recognize the spoon can catapult, or equivalently return catapult as one of the sets of things spoon can do, it would have to be specifically trained upon catapult too as one of the responses. But this generalizes quickly because there's many other things a spoon can do besides being part of a catapulting system. And you would have to train the network on all the things the spoon can do, which is equivalent to roughly saying the net must be trained on all possible pairs, something that the theorist Robert French pointed out in 1990 in the journal Mind as an extremely difficult thing for the Turing test problem that a net would face. The difficulty is new pairings are always being created. Because what we really have going on here is the projection of a dynamic invariant structure upon a possible component. For example, the invariant structure, the forces involved in catapulting are being projected, the entire structure, upon the spoon, or equivalently, the spoon is being inserted into this invariant structure to see if it can support the invariance, forces, dynamics, visual effects, etc., all involved in the event. This projection of a component within a dynamic invariant structure is the basis of analogy. And we'll deal with this more to come. But the point being, the memory system must incorporate the invariant structures, which include the dynamic forces of events. Static elements and relations are utterly insufficient. And to note, it is the failure to handle analogy that is at the base of computer language understanding difficulties. Hofstadter and Sander, in their recent book Surfaces and Essences, 2013, which was entirely devoted to the problem of analogy, eviscerated all current computer language understanding programs. Why? Well, first of all, for Hofstadter and Sander, they could not see, and not certain of, obviously, how computers can handle, computer systems can handle analogy. As we've just seen, you have all of these real concrete invariants and forces over time to deal with. And the computer model, the AI model, the language understanding models all ignore these invariant structures. They cannot be handled in current models. It's worse than that. And my little devil takes glee in this. The network has to handle what I like to term the parametric variation of Qs, or varying constraints on a concrete Q event. Just to get an idea, here we have a law for the growth of a tree for Bingham in 1993, where the growth of the tree is specified as a function of height, the number of branches per height, the diameter of the branches is a function of height, and we can grow that tree. That tree was, the little tree on the left was grown to the tree on the right via this formula. It's a invariance law specifying growth of a tree. So in memory literature, there is a recognition set of experiments on recognizing things. For example, I could simply be given, as part of a large set of stimuli, a tree. So I could have one of these trees, I could have a cup, I could have a spoon, I could have a bowl, etc. And so I'm given a long list or set of things, and then later on I'm shown things one by one and asked, was this in the list or not? Did you see this or not? Do you recognize this? And you can even assign familiarity values, okay? The subject can say from scale 1 to 5, 5 being the highest, what's your familiarity sense that this particular tree or bowl was in part of the original set that you saw? Well, in other words, we could be given the tree on the left or the tree on the right and ask, did you see this or that? In other words, the familiarity value that you assign could be a function of, and will be a function of, the increasing parametric fidelity to that cue. That is, if I was given the tree on the left and now I'm showing the tree on the right, well, I've diverged as a function of those parameter values specifying the growth of the tree away from the original tree that I was given, and my familiarity value should be therefore dropping as a function of the divergence from that original tree along the lines of those parameters. In other words, familiarity values will be a function, recognition familiarity values will be a function of these parameter values. Here's another one. This was a little experiment that Jenkins, Walden, Pittenger did involving walking up a campus, and they took pictures or slides of the campus as they walked up the campus mall. Now you're creating a flow field as you flow along the campus, and they left 6 slides out purposely of this when they presented slides to these subjects showing them the walk over the campus. And the subjects were quite easily able to say, yes, I saw that, but when it came to one of the slides where the 6 slides were left out, they'd realized that, well, they hadn't seen that chunk of this flow field specified. So fundamentally, you're parameterizing a flow field here, and the familiarity values are a function of the closeness to the original flow and chunks thereof that were specified. For another, remember our little rule for the aging of a facial profile specified by Bob Shaw, where we have a cardioid. Cardioid is placed on the skull placed on a coordinate system, and the coordinate system stretched via a strain transformation, which is equivalent to stretching the skull as though we're on a rubber sheet in all directions. And the value of that amount of strain is the strain transformation, and that specifies increasingly aging profiles. And we could easily have presented one of these faces, one of these profiles, as part of a recognition test, where it's one of the recognition items, and then we're asked, did you see this profile or not? Rate that as a familiarity value. And again, we're going to get familiarity values as a function of the closeness to the strain value. We're parameterizing the strain value of the profile. Another big one in memory research was something that was discovered by Jennifer Freyd called representational momentum. For example, she would show people a little square there, and she would show 3 successive versions of this square as they rotate. And what she would discover is that when a memory test came along, the preferred memory rotation or position of that square by people, subjects as they remembered, was the 4th one. In other words, they were preferring or remembering where they saw the square going rotationally, so to speak. In other words, in this particular phenomenon, we're really simply parameterizing angular velocity. And the subject is remembering the angular velocity. And we could take the same thing here with our perceived slant. For example, our little rotating flag here, our stiff rotating flag with its velocity flow field flying over it, is got a perceived slant, and that's parameterized by what's a mathematical value in terms of the intensity of the velocity flow. And we can easily imagine a experimental setup similar to Jennifer Freyd, where we have a rotating flag, and again we're asking for we should discover that the preferred memory is a function of the intensity of the slant, or again we're parameterizing intensity of slant. So what is needed in a system for redintegration? But we see that we can take a spoon, and via its radial amplitude, the resistance to the motion, via the medium, the periodicity, the adiabatic invariant value, the radial flow, the inertial tensor et al., we can reconstruct various events, whether it be batter, whether it be coffee, etc. Well, what it says is the memory system must incorporate the invariance laws and parameters that specify the event. Any memory system must incorporate the invariance laws and parameters that specify the event. That is, equivalently, the memory system must be sensitive to the parameterization of the dynamics of the event, and the final kicker, that memory system has to be operated integrally within the indivisible flow of time, because these invariants are defined only over time and over flow. So when, again, we have an experience like we're driving up a mountainside and we have a sinusoidal changing flow field as the road curves and turns, in order to redintegrate that experience, we represent this changing pattern of flow. I find it interesting. I would note that my wife, when we drive a certain very curved section on the Milwaukee freeway, she always says she remembers driving in California along a certain stretch of freeway, where again the flow field that is being recreated is redintegrating this past experience of her time in California. So what we're doing, in other words, is throwing the brain as a reconstructive wave into the same original modulation pattern, or quote frequency pattern, quote, where obviously we're talking very complex neural patterns that form an overall frequency. Now what I've been describing here is a theory of direct memory. Why direct memory? Well, we are not constructing a memory from stored elements in the brain, stored features. In direct perception, we are not constructing an image from stored elements, as we are in indirect realism or indirect perception, but rather directly specifying an event in the holographic field. So here in the memory context, we are directly assessing or retrieving an event from our far extended in the past, remember, in our four-dimensional structure, experience. So this is a theory of and model of direct memory. Now finally, I return then to this general model of Bergson, where we're dealing with ourselves, our being, as four-dimensional beings, where the 4D extent of our experience is unextended, but laid out along the fourth dimension in detail. The implication is that all of our experience is available. Now, this model, of course, is not accepted by cognitive science. Remember, cognitive science is breaking events down into features, static features, and/or states. For example, Barcelow's biting face we discussed in part 2, where in reality he's taking a facial flow field, a flowing field of a face biting a carrot and storing them as 3 static states. So all this is being broken down in various efforts for storage as static elements. Their heads are in the sand over velocity flows, over dynamics defined over flowing forces. These are simply being ignored. Yet there's plenty of evidence that all experience is indeed available and available in detail. I'm just going to give a few here. Aldous Huxley, for example, could put himself in a meditative state where he was able to retrieve every book he had ever read. There were Talmudic scholars, this is described in a book called White Gloves, who, when a pin was placed through the pages of the Talmud, and the Talmud, it must be understood, is extremely voluminous, so we're talking volumes of the Talmud, they could tell you every word that was pierced by the pin. So if the pin pierced, say, a couple dozen pages, they were able to describe each word pierced by that pin on every page. Oliver Sox Twins, these were somewhat retarded twins, but nevertheless had interesting abilities, could describe the details of any day in their life, what they ate, what they watched on TV, what the weather was, as though they were watching a panorama unfold before their inner eye. This could go on, including experimental results that are also indicative of this detailed storage. There's just no theoretical model, say for Bergson's, that proposes this, so it is not explored in academic research. There's another reason that we require the totality of experience to be stored, so to speak, stored. Hofstadter and Sander, in their book, which we noted before, actually opened the book with this quote: "Analogy is the fuel and fire of thinking," which is expressive of their view that analogy is the fundamental operation of thought. But we require the totality of experience and its full detail to support the ever-creative emergence of analogies. The little instance we gave of the spoon, now seen as a catapult, is a nice example of this, because out of our experience of watching pumpkin chunking on TV, pumpkin chunking competitions with catapults, or reading about Roman catapults, etc., out comes this analogy with we see spoons as possible participants in catapulting. And this goes on, but that experience has to be stored to form the foundation for the derivation of all these analogies. Now, this is a stake again in the heart of the current AI or computer model of mind, and we'll explore this more again down the road. Now, another memory theorist, actually a physicist, Walter Althusser, in his book, The Reflections on a Theory of Organisms, was very much a proponent of Bergson. In fact, he stated the book on cerebral memory has already been written. It's Bergson's Matter and Memory. I'm not going to go into detail on what cerebral memory is. Here, one can read it in my in my Collapsing the Singularity book, where I discuss Althusser to some degree. But Althusser was worried about the implications, the actual, probably metaphysical implications of Bergson's model. He tried to avoid the for the extent of being. He noted that the concept of a dimension implies an order. And he said the mixtures and the arbitrary and out of order intrusions of memories militate against this. In other words, he's thinking of, well, things like redintegration, where out of the blue comes my childhood experience of my house being hit by lightning, or out of the blue comes a experience a few years ago of snakes slithering past me as when I saw them moving in the grass, etc. So it seems like these experiences come out of order, so how can there be an order? But again, redintegration is indeed bringing back chunks of experience. But that doesn't mean that the order is not there. And given events are simply transformations in an indivisible flow of the universal field, there's no principle by which to jumble them in the first place. There's no principle by which they can be cut. There's no principle by which they can be segmented and stored in any arbitrary order. So arbitrary chunks can be retrieved, yes, certainly. This order in the four-dimensional extent, no. The subject of memory is a vast one, and we barely touched upon it here, or upon Bergson's prescient thoughts on memory. He had many subjects which I consider to be highly anticipatory of future findings in memory research, and there's aspects of his theory that are still profoundly relevant but not understood or touched upon at all in mainstream memory research. The explanatory power of invariant structures in memory, as we've explored it here, can be applied to many other aspects of the field. There's a fundamental phenomenon called priming, to which this applies. There's the recognition task we sort of mentioned. There's subject-performed task, which is an ecological paradigm just begging for a theory that undercuts a lot of the verbal learning research and findings precisely because it's very concrete. Subjects actually do concrete things like break pencils or bend wires or move coffee cups, etc. And there's a whole vast area of discoveries called concreteness effects and imagery effects that are all highly explainable by this particular invariant structure and ecological approach. But we're not going to go on into all that here, of course. But one can get more depth from me elsewhere on this entire subject. For example, the cost of explicit memory article, the analogical reminding article. There's a whole discussion on the possibility of direct memory in a book, an edited book. Best to see my site for that. And of course, the books I've got two called The Time in Memory and the Collapse into Singularity book. So far, we've really only touched on redintegration, or what's termed cued recall in the literature, where spoon is the cue, and we're trying to cue the recall of either batter or coffee. This type of memory is not to be confused with the clear, explicit recall of an event as an event in one's past. In other words, one can have redintegration without conscious memory or even conscious localization of the event as an event in one's past. This latter, conscious localization of an event in one's past, is termed explicit memory in the literature. Explicit memory requires consciousness. And remember, no AI or cognitive science model even needs consciousness or uses consciousness or employs it in the models of cognition, let alone do they understand why it is needed. Only Bergson's temporal metaphysics supports this being consciousness, explicit memory, and cognition requiring consciousness. As we'll see, this explicit memory is at another stake in the heart of current AI. So down the road, again, in my plan, we've got free will, voluntary action, stuff in education, implications thereof, evolution, and AI, and their unholy alliance between AI and evolution. I think I might throw in Sartre and his complete fail on his understanding of Bergson, and of course, this great question of Bergson, relativity, and Einstein. Next time, we'll deal with explicit memory. What is it? Why robots would need it and will never have it? And some initial considerations on thought and cognition. So, next, on explicit memory, leaving redintegration for now. Until next time, signing off.